Night along the Apennine spine is a stern tutor, and Monte Cassino sits in the front row, monk quiet, stone-armed, watching the valley of the Liri like a teacher who already knows the answer. The mountain is not merely height, it is a geometry of denial, a multiplication of slopes, terraces and gullies that turn every advance into a lesson. Down on the flats, the Rapido, later called Gari by those who mistrusted its name, slides black and indifferent, its banks a winter puzzle of mud and reed. Somewhere beyond, the sea sighs into the mouth of the Garigliano and then forgets what it told the shore. Between river and monastery runs the Gustav line, not a line so much as a sentence written with rock and wire, mines for commas, anti-tank ditches for colons, and the monastery's long gaze for a period. The question that arrives with headlights hooded and maps damp is a cruel one: can armor speak in mountains? Or does stone keep the last words Shermans gather like patient horses at the edges of fields that hate them? Their track shoulders carry a doctrine forged on plains, desert horizons, hedge-breaking lanes, step-borne thrusts now being asked to pronounce the unfamiliar syllables of terraces and switchbacks. Churchills crouch heavier, their long-boned hulls promising torque where speed will not serve. Sappers lace the foreground with white tape that seems confident until the second step beyond it. Infantry American, Indian, New Zealand, British, Moroccan, Algerian, Polish shoulder the grammar of rubble and stairwell, each contingent carrying a different music of orders, each learning how mountain takes the melody and writes it as percussion. Above them, the defenders' paratroopers turned stonecutters settle into caves and monk cells, their binoculars the austere cousins of icons. The monastery glows in the pale morning like a thought that will not yield to argument. The first assault touches the river at night, as if hoping to trick geology with darkness. Engineers wrestle assault boats through reeds that clutch like memories. Outboard motors cough lies, ropes hum, poles probe for depth and fine. Again and again, the confounding compromise between ford and flood. Mine tape flutters in a wind that does not care about caution. When the far bank catches the first boots, machine guns wake like cold dogs. A shell, flat and well placed, turns a plank bridge into a bright obituary. Tanks wait on the near bank, engines idling with the panting of big animals that do not understand why the men they carry can cross while they must kneel. You are tempted to scold the earth for refusal. The earth scolds you back by reminding that weight is not a negotiator. Day breaks over Casino Town and reveals a photograph of exhaustion. Streets are not streets, but zigzags of debris. Basements open like mouths. Every second window has learned to be a loophole. Every wall knows how to fall inward in just the way that kills a man who trusted it. The first Shermans that nose into the outskirts discover the tyranny of right angles, turrets constricted by lanes, sights insulted by smoke. The shot that should sing flattened into a cough by shattered brick. Infantry ride the backs and drop at corners the way commas drop in long sentences necessary pauses. Fragile protection. Somewhere a stoogie waits like a concise argument. A flash, a hit on the glacis, the ricochet's scream, then the second shot, placed with the patience of a craftsman. A crew tumbles out and becomes smoke and silence. Another tank edges forward in the same rut and refuses to learn the same lesson. An officer swears into a handset and discovers that cannot widen a street. High above, the monastery is bombed into a parable. Silver bellies slide through blue, bays of hatches open like indifferent eyelids, and an old stone thought is translated into dust and flame. The ground shakes, men cheer because the symbol has been attended to. Defenders flinch and then occupy the rubble with a gratitude learned from history. The new landscape is worse for tanks. The clean courtyards have become broken fangs. The wide steps turn to ankle-twisting talus. Every fallen arch a gun rest from which stone learns to aim. A tank graveyard is not a cemetery. It is an argument in which the terrain speaks better than either side expected. You are invited to count hulks and think in moral integers. The mountain invites you to count angles. On the flanks, the mountain tribes of the war climb. Gumier move like rumors through gullies goats would resent, knives learning the long grammar of rock. Indian sappers coax mule columns into improbable corridors and write roads where maps had none. New Zealanders and British shoulder their way along spines where a slip costs more than delay. The French Expeditionary Corps shows what audacity looks like when translated into altitude. Armor watches these ascents with a willing jealousy. The question shifts if tanks cannot climb. Can the men with them widen a ledge until steel summons itself upward? A Churchill tries. Its driver feeling for grip the way a pianist feels for a key in the dark. Track grousers bite. The hull lurches like a doctrine reconsidering. Rear bogies kick loose a small avalanche that writes impatience into the valley. In that small victory lies a hint the mountain relents only for those who accept its tempo. Casino Town becomes a teacher of intimacy. House by house, stair by stair, a distinct arithmetic governs life the angle of a doorway, the thread count of a sandbag, the seconds between a smoke canister and the foot that must follow it. Tanks crouch as midwives to these maneuvers, placing turrets like shields, offering sudden blasphemies of he into rooms with too many opinions. A Sherman presents its flank for an instant too long and learns that paratroopers have memorized the quick book of Piat and Panzerfaust. Another holds tight, barrels depressed, coax machine gun stitching curtains of brick dust that men walk through as if weather were a kind of courage. A tank graveyard is built as much from seconds misspent as from hits received. In the second act, the river is crossed with a more dutiful cruelty. Bailey bridges rise as metal psalms sung under fire. Engineers count in spans and swears. A platoon of tanks edges onto timbers that preach both salvation and collapse. On the far bank, mud tries to turn a brigade into sculpture. Recovery crews become the secret patrons of doctrine. A-frames groan, winches purr, chains speak in iron vowels, and another vehicle is stolen back from the appetite of the ground. You, who love the tales of assault guns and tigers, must make room for the heroism of a man with a sledge and a spanner. Spring leans into the valley and paints it with fake hope. Poppies nod at minds that do not care. Rome sits invisible beyond a mountain shoulder, tempting with its syllables. Another bombing shifts the monastery from ruin into ruin rearranged. Poles enter the Play 2 Corps carrying the biographies of 2 invasions and the ferocious courtesy of exiles who intend to pay debts. They study slopes the way saints once studied sin. They map chutes and saddles, give names to stones, measure the stubbornness of sky. Tanks wait below like oxen who have learned to love yoke and fear cliff. The mountain whispers that only hand and foot deserve this summit. The valley insists that steel must at least be seen to try. A detachment of Churchills close coupled, heavy-shouldered finds a way. Sappers chisel and pry, lay fascines like offerings, lash logs where nature failed to provide ribs. The tanks climb not with valor but with a carpenter's patience. Each meter costs minutes, each minute, a book of risk. A thrown track is a sentence interrupted by silence. A new path is a paragraph added where editors had said the draft was final. When the first turret lifts into air higher than it had any right to be, infantry cheer not because the war is won, but because the category of possible has been rewritten. The defenders reply with machine guns that sound exhausted and precise. Stone, somehow, does not choose a side. This theater loves paradox. The monastery, holy and ruined. The river, shallow and murderous. The tanks, powerful and delicate. The mountain, patient and swift when it speaks as gravity. The graveyard question keeps repeating, and the answer keeps refusing to stay singular. In certain lanes, those cunning alleys where fields of fire crisscross like string art tanks die twice, once as machines, then as monuments that make their siblings hesitate into becoming targets. In other places, terraces hard won by pick-and-hand tanks live as shelter and chorus. Their guns the loud convictions behind the infantry's close argument. The mountain accepts both outcomes with the calm of geology. Night falls like a lid with holes punched in it. Flares stitch pale zippers across the slope. Somewhere a tank idles all night because a cold engine is a murdered morning. Somewhere a chaplain whispers in a slit trench under a sky stiff with stars. Somewhere a German observer writes in a notebook that he has learned the taste of dust so thoroughly he can guess the caliber by grit between his teeth. Somewhere a sapper sleeps with a roll of tape under his head, trusting a small ritual more than any abstraction. The monastery sits, no longer a building but a contour of memory and will. Mountain war does not progress, it accumulates. Each assault adds a layer to the story. A collapsed culvert now turned to cover. A previously honest wall, now treacherous. A bridge too narrow yesterday widened by a day of nerve. Tanks join, leave, return. The way a chorus enters and exits a play that it refuses to upstage. The idea of a graveyard remains, but it shares space with a quieter concept garden. The earth grows what is planted sometimes hulks, sometimes passages. Those who learn to plant the latter reap yards and then slopes, then song. The wind at dawn carries the mixed scent of cordite and thyme. A priest raises a hand on a terrace. A gun captain checks his quadrant. A sergeant wraps a spare track pin with rag so it won't clink as he runs. Somewhere, a radio speaks in languages and numbers that agree on the necessity of 10 more meters. Tanks wake like old dogs, cough, and consent. The mountain leans back to listen. The question wears a tired smile. A tank graveyard stone has its preferences. Yes, but courage that learns geometry can sometimes teach stone new manners. Dawn combs the slopes with pale teeth and finds the same knots of ruin refusing to yield. Cassino Town is a geography of edges, sharpened by memory. The Hotel Continental crouched like a stone prow. The shattered railway station listing among twisted tracks and carriage bones. The pale ghost of a river pretending innocence as it braids mud with reed. Fallschirmjäger hold the higher syllables of the landscape with the patience of men who have turned rock into profession. Below, armor queues behind the sapper's tape and waits for a permission only geometry can grant. You look at the shapes Sherman square-shouldered in the morning cold. Churchill squat and implacable, and wonder which will be first to mistake perseverance for passage. The day's first movement is small and exact. Engineers test the far bank with poles, then with courage, then with timber. The bridge that rises under their hands is the grammar lesson everyone else must speak span. Lash, brace, pray. Tanks cross at a walking pace that insults their design, each link on the track counting consequences. On the edge of town, a platoon fans along a lane already reshaped by blast into a coarse stare. Rubble is both enemy and ally, and the crew commander who remembers that paradox lives a little longer. A stug in a courtyard makes its case not loud, just decisive. The first Sherman takes the punctuation in the chest and slumps like a sentence that never found its verb. The second learns from the first in angles. A round glances, a wall disintegrates. A room exhales furniture and hope. The third carries infantry to the next doorway and becomes a door itself. Turret pressed to a facade as if eavesdropping on the building's remaining courage. At the railway station, rails grin up from the ballast like teeth in a skull. The station house, amputated by bombs, still knows how to shelter a gun. Tanks cannot pivot here without making themselves nouns in a story written for rifles. They move instead like careful adverbs, slowly, precisely, briefly adding protection to men who turn embankments into chapters of approach. Beyond, the rail yard is a museum of angles. A carriage on its side becomes an altar for a machine gun. A water tower, hold but upright, refuses to fall in any useful direction. Sleepers stacked for repair become a palisade the original surveyor never intended. This is where mountains extend themselves into towns by other means, not height now, but obstruction, not cliff, but corner. The notion of graveyard grows teeth during the second assault. Fresh bomb lines gouge the monastery into a different arrangement of defiance, and the rubble becomes more articulate. New Zealanders push through the station district with a stubborn clarity, and armor stung by yesterday returns as a chorus rather than a soloist. Tanks post themselves at junctions as if during a case. Their cannon speak not to roam, but to cancel. A shot through a door frame turns a 10-man problem into 3. A shell placed under the lip of a stair decides a debate without witnesses. For a few meters at a time, Metal and men behave like a single animal. Then a flank is shown to a cellar. A jet of flame or a shaped charge corrects the presumption. Smoke writes a lesson on air. If you are counting, your ledger fills with halves, half streets won, half houses cleared, a half hour of visibility before the mountain pulls fog like a blanket across the face. Up on the slope, where the monastery has poured its stones into the gullies, a different arithmetic rules. Gurkhas step into niches no history book had measured. Knives and ankles conversing with rock. Indian sappers pull mules toward terraces that deny even the pretense of roads. French and North African mountaineers slip into ravines that goats would dislike and find, at their tops. German fire waiting with a silence that is not surprise but readiness. Tanks below tilt their heads to watch. Engines thrumming with a canine wish to follow. The question raises its chin if steel cannot climb. Can steel convince stone by other means? A Churchill edges onto a terrace the width of a table. Grousers catching purchase the way fingers find ledges. The hull dips and recovers. A sapper slaps a hand against armor as if affirming a friendship. The mountain allows one more axle length of presumption. There is no sprint here, only a calendar of inches. In the cellars of Casino Town, time grows stale. Rooms become seasons. Men measure distance in door frames and breaths. A tank nose peeps into a lateral street and draws a line of tracers that iron a corridor of air into obedience long enough for a squad to cross. The defenders answer with thrift a single rifle that knows exactly where to aim to interrupt a habit. A grenade that uses a puddle to multiply its scorn. A machine gun that fires 5 perfect seconds and changes the hour. The graveyard gathers additions turrets stuck at awkward angles. Tracks peeled like skins. Hulls scorched into anonymity. Yet beside them stand survivors dusted white as statues. Their crews inside balancing maps in their heads no longer useful to anyone but them. When storms close the sky, the town's acoustics change. Walls turn every report into rumor. The mountain sends echoes down like opinions from a committee. Tanks follow sappers through alleys they have widened with jackhammers and small blasphemies. An armored recovery vehicle drags a wounded Sherman backward with the tenderness of an undertaker. A chain snaps. Both lurch. Men jump aside and swear in several tongues the same short prayer. This unphotographable labor is the counter-chorus to the graveyard myth for every hulk abandoned. 2 are stolen back from mud and gravity by the marriage of leverage and will. You are reminded that victory often looks like maintenance with a pulse. Around the monastery, the Poles begin to write their chapter, not by storm but by succession of trials. They name stones and saddles as other men name saints. They calibrate seconds of cloud between mortar, cough, and burst. They build ladders not for walls but for light, trying to climb the horizon itself. Armor below lends what it can, a direct fire punctuation against caves that speak too confidently. A smoke screen that turns accuracy into suspicion. When a Polish patrol reaches a shelf christened in the morning and despised by noon, a tank down in the flats fires a shell that lands like a letter folded twice. The mountain is reading, even when it refuses to sign. The spring's first honest sun arrives like an insult and a blessing. It hardens verges enough for a line of tanks to hazard the Via Casalina under a garnish of smoke. It glints on mines made from parts of other wars. It warms the backs of men whose shoulders have forgotten softness. A column noses toward the Continental again. Gunners rehearse the sequence of rooms they must erase. Sappers cradle Bangalore torpedoes like statements they are certain will not be misquoted. A paratrooper who has slept by a stone Jesus for months listens to the clank and thinks, against policy, about cities with straight avenues. The day proceeds in rectangles, courtyards, lobbies, staircases until the rectangles blur into exhaustion and the light admits it has no more to give. On a terrace above, a single Churchill becomes an argument made of torque and patience. Its driver, a man who has come to understand rock the way a sailor understands tide, inches the hull forward until the turret can see a sliver of monastery wall. The gunner breathes twice and lets the round go. Stone spits, displeased. The commander marks an inch in grease pencil on the mantle to show what he has learned. Down below, a Sherman posts itself broadside against an alley the only way to offer its thickest face to the most likely sin, and soaks an hour's malice that would otherwise have fallen human. Every theater has its saints. At Cassino, they are often made of steel and stubbornness. Night replants the question. Flares stitch a hemline across the ruins. Tracer threads show where ideals go to die. The river ticks and whispers and pretends innocence again. In dugouts and hulls, the smell is cordite and damp wool, oil and patience. A pianist in a wrecked cafe touches keys that answer with dust. A medic writes numbers on a cuff with the point of a knife. A chaplain's hand hesitates over a prayer he has said too often to believe and too seldom to forget. You watch from your distance and want the narrative to resolve. The mountain refuses, offering instead the slow diplomacy of attrition and the miracle of inches. And then, as all long arguments do, it shifts by accumulation. The flanks, worried thin by weeks of climbing men and mule-borne artillery, begin to let go. A path that resisted boots yesterday accepts them today. A gully that spoke German last week learns a few Polish syllables. A Bailey bridge that trembled now hums when tanks cross, as if pleased with its own courage. The graveyard remains. Yes, rows of blackened hulls like brackets around a brutal text, but beside it grow lanes. Terraces widened into roads. Corners that now belong to those who survived them. Stone has not yielded to shock. It has yielded to study. Dawn leans its ear to the monastery's ruins and hears new footsteps in old cloisters. Down below, tanks idle like old oxen at the start of plow day, steam rising, crews unwrapping the same breakfast they unwrapped yesterday and will unwrap tomorrow. The river looks thinner, the town thicker with resolve, the mountain slightly less sure of its exclusivity. The question still hangs in the air. True as weather mountainous terrain, a tank graveyard. The answer returns. Complicated and honest, a graveyard when pride drives and haste pretends, a garden when patience learns stone, when steel allows hands and feet to teach it the mountain's music. Morning returns with a steadier hand, as if the mountain had grown used to being asked the same hard question. The Rapido's skin shows less malice. The reed beds hold fewer secrets. The white tape laid by sappers yesterday still trembles where the wind has not found time to tear it. Cassino's ruins breathe a sour, calm, powdered brick dust. Cordite that has settled into the furniture of air. A faint sweetness from sapped cellars where fruit once stood in jars. The Fallschirmjäger keep their catechism with the economy of men who have learned exactly how much movement a silhouette can afford. Down on the flats, engines cough awake, and armor puts on its day face, Sherman's wiping dew from periscopes with rag and glove, Churchill's listening for their own heartbeats under steel. The battle's grammar thickens. No one believes in surprise anymore. They believe in sequence. A bridge is put up because a culvert failed. A culvert is chosen because the river was stingy. A lane is chosen because the last one turned a platoon into a footnote. Tanks nose forward not as cavalry, but as carpenter's brace, prop, shoulder. A Sherman places its bulk at the mouth of an alley so infantry can slip along a wall, throwing grenades with the half-prayer, half-practice motion that becomes second nature in cities. Across from it, a Stug again refuses to be theatrical, raises its blunt snout, and erases a corner. Both crews know they are not dueling, they are editing. By mid-morning, the light shows the monastery's ribs with painful clarity. The ruin, bombed and rebombed, has learned to host defenders the way a cliff hosts swallows. Caves below the cloister doors look inward to machine gun nests. Steps that once rose in elegant equations, now knot ankles and redirect breath. The Polish plan carries itself like an oath terraces named, saddles memorized, a sequence of ascents that respects both stone and mortality. Below, armor accepts the role of chorus again firing into cave mouths with he that turns stone to slivers and rumor, throwing smoke when a slope has grown too honest, blocking streets with their own bodies so that foot and hand can keep their promises. The tank graveyard argument loses some of its swagger. You're asked to see the survivors as acts of study rather than luck. The Liri Valley to the west lures with promises of lanes and orchards, a flanksman's dream. There, the French Expeditionary Corps, mountain-bred and mule-wise, unbuttons the Urunchi, leaning into heights that had considered themselves untouchable. Their success rephrases the battlefield. What was a locked gate hints at a side door. Indian sappers, already part rumor, part recipe. Haul bridging bays into ravines goats have not blessed. Ganesh sits in the crease of a sapper's mind, while a European saint travels in his pocket. Tanks do not try to imitate. They wait for the sign that the valley will admit their weight without making a joke of it. At the railway station, the day's argument refuses to end, and tanks lend punctuation. A Sherman, nose into rubble, searches for a window large enough to be a sentence. The gunner takes the breath that has become ritual and presses. The shell blows plaster like winter's first snow. A dust angel rises the color of fatigue. A platoon scuttles across the rails, feet ringing iron with that obscene chiming known only at war. The next tank, learning from a cousin's memorialized mistake, refuses to park in a perfect ambush cone, chooses an ugly place instead, survives. Each crew invents a micro-doctrine fire. 3. Move 1. Watch the cellar lips. Trust the sapper with the coil of wire around his neck because his path is the only scripture that has not lied. Afternoon brings a weather of decisions. Clouds boil and flatten. The kind of sky that steals contrast from optics and courage from the unwary. The Via Casilina, that iron thread, lies under a shroud of smoke laid by mortars with more faith than sight. Tanks threaded in segments, like beads pushed across a string by a patient child. On a terrace above, a Polish patrol reaches a ruin that has lost the memory of its room numbers and fines. As always at Cassino, that victory is an inch argued into a yard. A gun below speaks the long syllable of direct fire. A cave above changes its mind. The mountain learns the taste of persistence. In the town's interior, intimacy hardens into craft. Infantry call for armor not to break through, but to hold still be wall. Be rumor. Be thunder. A Churchill eases its hull across a crater lip and steadies. Its gunner places a round into stairwell darkness and quiets a decade's worth of ghosts. A Sherman, bogey squealing, refuses to reverse out of a cul-de-sac because to move would make the men around it mortal again. The driver listens to a world of noise filtered through steel and decides not to decide. The machine becomes a noun shelter. Those who mistake only verbs for heroism have never been here. The Rapido diminishes in arrogance as spring insists. Engineers throw slender tunnels of steel and timber over it as if apologizing for all the months of loud insistence. A single Bailey hums when a tank crosses, a tone that unnerves and comforts in the same breath. It sounds like a violin played by a cautious god. On the far bank, mud still negotiates every axle. Recovery crews wait like fishermen on a bank. Lines of chain and cable coiled into neat hopes. There are days we call offensive that are actually rescue. Cassino teaches both dialects. The defenders bind their skill to stone with a tenderness you do not expect. A paratrooper lights a cigarette with the care of a man disarming himself. His mate regards the ruin as one might regard a stubborn friend affection, complicated by weary scorn. They have held longer than the calendar predicted. They will hold again and again until the line they are sewn into unthreads elsewhere. Above them, the sky trades flares with stars. Below them, tanks trade shells with cellars. Between, the monastery listens like a judge who has already written the verdict and still allows the advocates to speak. Toward evening, the flanks begin to speak louder. The Urunchi yields roads you could not draw, only discover, and those roads tug at the German hinge that has made Cassino a puzzle worth its obsession. Somewhere near Piedimonte, the promise of a gap turns from rumor to measurable width. In the valley around Aquino fields lie wider than grief. Armor smells the change before it sees it, the way a horse turns its head before a gate is open. The graveyard fears give way to the old impatience, the wish to run. To finally employ the grammar tanks were born with space. Speed, shock but caution, still whispers the words learned in the rubble angle. Pause. Shield. The night before ascent's end feels unremarkable. Men eat without expectation. A tank idles for a minute too long because its crew is arguing metaphysics with a faulty magneto. A sapper sleeps with one boot off and one on. A chaplain stares at a scrap of wall with a fresco fragment that has outlived better sermons. You adjust your own heartbeat to the rhythm of the place, slow, then quick, then slow. This is how a mountain is convinced, not by a single appeal, but by respectful repetition. Then the morning that changes, the tense comes. Without drumroll, like a page turning, on the slopes. Poles in faded field caps move like men with a debt schedule they will pay and be done. Terraces that resisted for weeks now accept feet that have learned humility. Caves that once spoke machine gun German fall oddly silent, as if language itself has taken a breath. A white and red flag appears like a conclusion rather than an event. The monastery's ruin, emptied by order, receives a visitor that has been rehearsed in exile since September. A runner carries a note that is really a sentence. A phone that never quite worked relays a fragment that is enough. The mountain, which never chose a side, records what has happened and what it cost. Down in the valley, the sound changes timbre. Route 6. Once a dare begins to answer to traffic, the Liri's flats, once theoretical, take on the practicality of lanes. Tanks roll with a confidence that doesn't trip into arrogance. They have learned the mountain's terms and intend to apply them to open ground. No sprints without bridges. No bravado without sappers. No advance that cannot be fed at dusk. The graveyard recedes into a row of silhouettes that teach respect more than fear. The garden of passages grows. After months of unkind pedagogy, Cassino becomes a threshold rather than a wall. Rome's name floats nearer in the air, heavy now with obligations rather than merely sweet. The crews who made shelter out of steel re-oil their hatches and taste dust that is no longer flavored with stone. The infantry who learned to breathe through rubble gaze at orchards as if at wide rooms. You who have followed this long argument are invited to hold two truths at once. Mountains can kill tanks. Mountains can be taught to bear them. Tanks can be graves. Tanks can be bridges. The monastery's silence agrees with neither and blesses both with the kind of hard grace only places like this can afford. The valley opens like a held breath, finally released, and the sound changes, shape less echo, more distance. Orchards stand in neat, bruised rows. Fields lie like pages awaiting script. Route 6 unwinds with a battered dignity. The long sentence that once snaked under the monastery's shadow, now stepping out into the Liri with tentative confidence. The armies descend from the theology of stone to the prose of earth, and armor feels its old language stirring in the throat. Shermans stretch their backs, Churchills roll their shoulders, engines clear their voices. The doctrine of space, once an embarrassed guest comes forward to take a seat. Yet the valley does not forgive ignorance. The ground is more generous. The mind must be too. Sappers lead again, because permission precedes momentum. Mind tape turns from a narrow whisper to wide white lanes. The calligraphy of survival written large. Bulldozers with armor plates stitched to their ribs nose into culverts that lie like sulking beasts. Graders cuff potholes into compliance. Bridging teams marry spans whose names will never be spoken on any parade ground to creeks that learned malice from winter. A tank graveyard becomes less a threat than a memory, but the valley offers new ways to dye fields, crisscrossed by hidden ditches, causeways that crumble when too many axles trust them, irrigation cuts that pull tracks sideways with a lover's insistence. Those who believe victory is only straight roads discover subtler verbs shift. Wait, pause. The defenders do not waste the gift of flat land. Where the mountain taught patience, the valley teaches arrangement. Anti-tank guns crouch in sunken lanes like arguments prepared in advance. A lone long barrel crouches in a copse and works through its list with an accountant's calm. Panzer grenadiers, relieved to measure distance in strides rather than steps, make hedgerows their tutors. Tanks have room, but so does the 75 aimed across two fields. So does the mortar set at the corner of an orchard, where its parabolas speak fluent rural. The question evolves: does the valley become a runway or a chessboard? Columns thicken, then braid, then soared again under hands that have become very skilled at traffic. A scout car returns with map edges still damp from rain and rumor. A liaison pilot draws invisible chalk lines in the air above ponds that will eat a company. A platoon commander presses a knuckle to the glass of his compass and mutters the half-prayer that keeps men between grid lines and graves. On the left, French units light-footed from the heights spill down into villages that blink and pretend innocence. On the right, the promise of a bend around Piedemonte tightens into a task. The Poles look back once at the ruin under their flag, and then forward because forward is the only civilized direction. In these broad rooms of field and lane, specialized voices step to the fore. A Churchill Avery arrives like a tradesman with a cart of blunt miracles, a petard that talks to pillboxes in syllables understood by concrete, a fascine rolled like an offering that turns ditch to rumor, a bridge thrown like a coat across a puddle, pretending to be a moat. A crocodile eases its snout and reheats the courage of those who had grown too fond of masonry. Behind them, unglamorous cousins keep the day possible recovery vehicles with arms that pick the stubborn out of ditches, ambulances that memorize every bump between pain and morphine, fuel Bowsers that smell like the future. The tanks reacquaint themselves with speed but keep the mountain's manners. A troop advances by bounds that look like patience, wearing boots one hull forward to the next haystack. Another covering, the third angling toward a ditch whose depth is guessed and then confirmed by a sapper who trusts his pole more than any optimism. Between orchards, machine guns test the air, and the air replies with tracers like thin red sentences advising caution. The long grass hides opinions. The short grass hides wire. The crews talk in steady domestic tones. Up two, left one, on words that sound like carpentry and save lives like poetry. Rear guards work their black craft with a composer's discipline. A gun in place to catch a flanking lane fires twice and moves, leaving its signature like a rumor. A small line of mines buried at the hinge of two fields persuades a squadron to accept a worse axis. A burned carcass becomes theater smoke, a curtain for the shifting of props, stench a speech that makes haste distrust itself. Tanks learn to read smoke as well as maps rising straight. It means emptiness, drifting, a gun pulled back. Always. The possibility that the obvious is bait. Those who were made arrogant by room become literate again under the stern alphabet of rearguard delay. Aquino's airfield, with its long, battered stripe, looks like a promise and behaves like a trap. The ground is firm but too exposed. Movement is easy but too watched. A squadron tests the reach, finds the geometry of flanking fire still valid even on an honest plane, and withdraws without drama, wiser. The lesson is old and fresh space is neither friend nor enemy. It is a medium. The hand that draws through it must know pressure. So the columns slide along the hedges and stone walls, shoulder rubbing with houses that have kept their shutters closed for months and now peep with a caution older than uniforms. In the shadow of still distant Rome's syllables, discipline holds the appetite in check. Artillery steps forward by measured intervals. Guns unlimbered with the care of grand pianos. Observers read the land with spectacles that see through dust to the mathematics beneath. Counter-battery stalks those quiet predators in copses and along farm tracks. The tanks, once the song, now harmonized supporting, fixing, blasting, rarely rushing, rarely left alone to improvise. Infantry, delighted to exchange stairwells for ditches, rediscover the rhythm of section, rush to move. One watches, then above everything a mortar coughs like an elderly neighbor clearing a throat, and the lane falls quiet enough for boot soles to count meters again. The Hitler line, whatever its local name, announces itself not as spectacle, but as texture. Wire returns in tangled paragraphs. Mine belts speak with the old, contemptuous syllables. Concrete appears, not in grandeur, but in honest, low shapes that know their purpose. Armor halts not because courage dwindles, but because courage obeys its tutor, sappers first, smoke second, weight third. Here the graveyard myth tries to revive open approaches cupped by well-sighted guns. Fields pre-sighted until the grass itself seems treacherous, but the army that learned Cassino's manners refuses to play the earlier script. Bridges are wheelbarrowed forward under curtains of smoke that look like pennants. Avers waddle up to kiss apertures with explosive grammar. Crocodiles speak the oldest language and shorten arguments the way fire always has. In the interludes between thrusts, life insists. A farmer steps out to touch an apple tree and finds his hands shaking with a grief he cannot inventory. A crewman ties a bootlace with fingers that remember a child's shoe. A clerk dockets a requisition for track pins and writes, accidentally, his mother's name in the margin. A chaplain blesses an orchard not because liturgy requires it, but because he misses the shapes of sanctuaries. WWII, who have been watching the grammar of machines against ground, are reminded that the story is written in human ink and paper tears. The counterpoint sings on the ridges. French mountain troops, now authors of lanes on maps that once pretended there were none, continue to unbutton the high country. Each road pried out of rock tugs at the German shoulder that had anchored Cassino's insolence. Indian and British units knit the gains to the valley floor, pulling telephone lines like nerves and posting way markers that speak multiple tongues but one truth forward. Carefully, the Poles, finished with Monk's work, descend as if reluctant to abandon a classroom that finally conceded its lesson. The joined effect is a hinge opening with the patience of iron, and then momentum, that capricious god, consents. Route 6 begins to behave like a road again. Traffic becomes a river that knows its banks. Columns of armor slide past fields where cows stare with monarchic detachment. The sky grows larger. The monastery's ruin shrinks behind as if returning to legend. The graveyard fades to a row of cautionary silhouettes, each one a proverb against haste. The garden prognosis brightens engineers plant bridges like seeds, units harvest junctions like fruit, and the map acquires a new, simple verb through. But even as the highway invites acceleration, the learned restraint refuses to be shed. Tanks keep their intervals, guns keep their schedules, sappers keep their pride. A troop pauses at a crossroads because the ditch on the right is too symmetrical to be innocent. A sergeant tips a bayonet into the grass and finds wire. A driver edges left to avoid the depression where water pooled last night and would now be a suction cup. The army moves like an orchestra that has survived a harsh conductor tempo precise. Crescendos earned, rests respected. Evening lays bronze on the Liri, and the valley exhales the day's heat with relief. Mechanics clean bores with the affectionate contempt of men who have done a day's work. Someone tunes a guitar and offers a song half in Italian, half in hope. On a newly captured ridge, a field kitchen steams, and men line up with the discipline of hunger that intends to live. The monastery, far behind, dresses itself in failing light until its ruin looks like a painting of endurance rather than a portrait of violence. Rome's syllables draw nearer, not as velvet, but as obligation. This is the paradox Monte Cassino leaves in the mouth. Tanks have graves in mountains. Tanks have gardens in valleys. In both, tanks are most alive when they concede the primacy of hands, eyes, and the narrow, stubborn inches that human beings negotiate with stubborn earth. The crews feel the lesson in their bones as engines cool. Steel is instrument, not author. Terrain is teacher, not stage. Patience is not the enemy of speed. It is the scaffold that lets speed climb without falling. Night thickens with moths that mistake headlights for moons. Orders move like low voices among tents and under hedgerows. Engineers coil tape for tomorrow's lanes. Artillery maps plot boxes no one will cheer. Tankers lay out breakfast tins and sleep with hatches cracked to let the world in enough to trust it. Beyond the next bend, the line of concrete and wire awaits in another guise, and beyond that, the city with 7 parables prepares its stone for new footprints. The question that began under Monk's walls follows in the wake like a familiar. The answer rides in the tracks cautious, persistent, ready to speak again in fields the color of dust and promise. Morning takes its time becoming noon, as if the valley itself were negotiating terms. Low mist hugs ditches and stone walls, sliding away only when engines insist. Route 6 breathes with measured traffic, side roads, newly promoted to roles they never auditioned for. Carry files of carriers and limbers. The prose beneath the poem. Ahead lies a belt of obstacles that prefers euphemism. Some call it the Hitler line. Others use village names like Buckles on a Strap, Ponte Corvo, Piedimonte, Aquino. Concrete crouches low, almost shy. Wire lies in jealous tangles. Minefields mutter their small, indiscriminate theology. The lesson changes tense again. The valley will not be a runway. It will be a workshop floor, and tanks will be foremen, not sprinters. The first engagements are conversations, not declarations. A platoon noses out from an olive grove and discovers that the field to its front has been rehearsed by geometry, the long 75 waiting to flex across the grain. A shallow swale coaxing hulls to present a cheek. A hedge trimmed by artillery into perfect lines of sight. One Sherman, cautious, angles and survives. Another, infected by a young impatience, shows a second too much confidence and is offered a bright, short sermon. Smoke answers like a curtain yanked between acts. A Churchill rolls into the ugly space on purpose and becomes a wall that breathes. Infantry spill around its flanks in squads that move as if rhythm had been reinvented for them 2 beats forward. One crouch, a pause for the mortar's cough, then another forward lean. None of it is theatrical. All of it saves inches. Sappers lead with the indifference of professionals who trust their gods but not their luck. Under the palms of their hands, the line's texture is revealed wires that lift easily because someone else has already taken the pull of them. Wires that bite back because winter gave them rust teeth. Pressure plates that listen for the weight of a tank. Trip wires that want the ankle of a man who hurried. A Bangalore tube is slid under a fence like a simple apology and then becomes a violent negation. A lane is chalked. Tape trembles in the wind like a reminder that ritual has weight. Where concrete presents small mouths, the AVREs step forward with their short, insolent grammar. Petards kiss apertures and break syllables into gravel. The tanks that were once accused of vanity behave like surgeons working at the edge of their tools' tolerances. Aquino's airfield watches like a jaundiced witness, its runway a scar that promises ease and delivers exposure. Squadrons test its length with thin courage and thick caution, find that the flanking ditches sing to enemy gunners like well-tuned instruments, and sidle back into orchards that are cramped but loyal. A crocodile bows its snout around a farmhouse converted to stubbornness and breathes a sentence no wall can out-argue. Flames select their own persuasion. Moments later, the argument ends in a bitter silence that tastes like victory and ash together. You are reminded that some problems yield to reason, others to heat. Neither is free. Midday tilts into the kind of light that punishes indecision. On the left, French troops, still carrying altitude in their lungs, unlace another hill chain and blow a draft through the valley's closed room. On the right, the ground around Piedimonte scowls earth corrugations, protecting cave mouths that can spit and vanish. A troop of Churchills eases into the shallow folds like men stepping onto a dance floor they have mapped under their souls. A round takes a front sprocket. The hull moans, becomes a monument. The AVRE behind accepts the lesson and chooses a less dignified approach, muddy, oblique, effective. A living tank is a book of compromises. A dead one is a proverb. The day grows literate. Between hedges, the infantry's old grammar of section rush returns with a new accent. Cassino has taught them that speed without cover is ambition. Cover without movement is theater. Here they speak in clauses stitched by mortar commas and machine gun semicolons. Their punctuation coordinated over nets that hum with mundane confidence. Over all of it, the artillery writes marginal notes, box barrages slithering forward by the measured pace of a man who refuses to hurry past a ditch. Concentrations that briefly make the far tree line into a vibrating insistence of splinters and shock. The tanks join the chorus in their new vocation, not a hero's monologue, but a baritone that makes space for tenors to cross the stage alive. At Ponte Corvo, the concrete proves honest and therefore unforgiving. Sighted low, it offers only opinions. Each must be countered at the exact angle and time. And Avra lumbers to within the distance where nerve is measured in the tongue's dryness, plants a charge like a gardener with brutal taste, reverses with a dignity that would be hilarious if it were not survival. The explosion is not heroic, it is correct. A lane opens that is only wide enough for one hull. That hull becomes a gate. Infantry filter into the courtyard of a farm that had grown wheat and then guns, and now grows a kind of quiet. A tank graveyard here would be an act of pride. A tank garden is a product of patience and teamwork, and the earth, when asked properly, consents. Rearguard fire keeps problems honest. A camouflaged 88 patient as a social club opens from a copse left unmolested for exactly too long and plucks a Sherman as if reminding the valley that flanks remain a moral issue. The reply is an orchestra's smoke to disorient, recce to knife around, a pair of long 17-pounders brought forward with the solemnity of a sermon. The duel lasts 3 minutes and an education. When it ends, the copse becomes timber, and the infantry move with the slightly embarrassed relief of men spared a lecture they feared would be memorized with blood. The tanks do not preen, they adjust their straps and check their tools. Vanity is for parades, and there are no parades permitted by this road. The smell of the day turns metallic iron heated and cooled, the wet breath of newly broken earth, petrol that escaped discipline and repented in dust. Mechanics in sleeves blackened to the elbow work miracles at the edges of fields, trading a road wheel from a burnt cousin to a living hull, truing a track on the doctrine of good enough to live. A driver, younger than the tank's design committee, learns the geography of the clutch the way a farmer learns his soil by touch, by listening, by accepting that some stubbornness is the fault of the season. These are the stories not told in the grand nouns. They are the verbs that the grand nouns ride. Toward evening, a gap becomes truth. What had been rumor on the lips of scouts and hope in the eyes of planners opens like a zipper teeth aligned by the day's persistence. Route 6 smiles the tired, triumphant smile of a patient who has weathered a long operation. Columns thicken into momentum, then thin into prudence again, because the doctrine is well taught. Now no gallop without flank guard, no sprint without sappers, no appetite without logistics at the table. The Hitler line name, texture, memory falls behind as a framework our side was required to learn before it could be moved. The valley becomes an invitation written in conditional verbs you may, if, you can, provided. In small places, life refuses to be ordered. A farmhouse kitchen exhales 40 years of soup into a lane where men pass with their weapons cradled like heavy infants. A calf blinks at a crocodile and decides that fire is not a thing to have an opinion about. A girl peeks from behind a shutter and cannot decide whether the tank is a dragon or a barn that learned to walk. A chaplain takes off his helmet to rub his scalp and looks suddenly like a man who used to repair clocks. He blesses a bridge whose bolts were torqued by boys who will never be named on bronze. You, who have traced battalions as if they were brushstrokes, are reminded that the hand that holds the brush is warm and fallible. Night gathers with less menace than last month. The line ahead lies in folds, the maps no longer lie about. Artillery plans for tomorrow's boxes are drafted with the calm of men in rhythm. Engineers coil their tape and write small notes like love letters to the next dawn. Good ground, left of milepost. Culvert weak, old orchard, good cover. Tank crews clean bores without ceremony. Check traverse. Count their luck with the modest superstition of survivors. The rumor in the air has a new vowel, not if, but when. Rome's syllables pulse close enough to taste dust and promise. Obligation and spectacle braided in stone. The lesson of Monte Cassino and the Liri settles into bone. Armor can die grandly in mountains. It can live stubbornly there, too. In valleys, it can forget the mountain's manners and be punished. Or it can import the courtesy it learned among terraces and cloisters and use speed like a tool instead of a drug. A graveyard becomes a warning, a garden the reward of patience, and across both. The truth that steel is honest when asked honest questions by hands that respect ground. The monastery's ruin, now behind and above, seems to nod in agreement, or perhaps that is only the wind. Before sleep takes them, men glance west, where the sky holds a city's glow like a held note. Boarders curl under their blankets, boots aligned by reflex. A sentry listens to crickets and finds their rhythm matches the ticking engine he still hears in his head. Tomorrow the road will widen into roads, the fields into choice, the battle into a pursuit that is also a test of memory. Do not run farther than your bridges. Do not desire more than your maps can feed. Do not spend the men faster than their names can be written. The valley cools. Engines tick as they shed heat. The tape on the lanes moves in a small night breeze like white reeds in a black stream. The army sleeps, poised between lessons learned and lessons about to be graded. Dawn irons the mist out of the Liri and lays a thin shine on Route 6 as if the road itself had washed its face for what comes next. Columns move with a practiced modesty, intervals held, eyes kept low, antennae flexing like reeds in a breeze. The lines on maps look simpler now, but the ground keeps its habit of difficult questions. Beyond the last low folds, Ponte Corvo behind. Ichino dim on the right, the way opens toward Soprano. Anagni, Valmontone, syllables that feel like stepping stones to a word heavier than all of them. Rome sits ahead in the air like an obligation, not a prize. The armies that have learned stone and field prepare to meet city without forgetting either lesson. The valley's grammar shifts again from punch to paragraph. Sappers write lanes through orchards and culverts with the poise of men who have already seen the worst and refuse to be hurried now that the best is possible. Tanks take their turn in sentences, a troop at the hedge comma, a squad crossing a farm track semicolon, artillery, patient as an editor, trimming the enemy's long-windedness with clean brackets of fire. Where the line stiffens on a rise too modest to deserve a name. Avrays trundle up with that ugly charm of machines that do exactly the job for which they were born, petard here, fascine there, a scab of timber laid across a ditch that has ambitions beyond its width. Crocodiles breathe brief paragraphs nobody likes to read and shorten arguments the way Flame always does, with terrible clarity. Rear guards, professional and sour. Right delay into the afternoon. An 88 opens from a stone terrace and then pulls back like a cat observed. A platoon of Panzer Grenadiers turns a narrow lane into a flute of bullets and then vanishes behind a wall that has learned to pivot without moving. The response is not indignation, but craft smoke placed not to hide, but to define reconnaissance slipping around edges that stop being sharp when looked at from the side. A pair of 17-pounders introduced with clerical respect to a copse that refuses to be honest. You want to rush. The day prefers proofs. Each cleared corner is less a victory than a solved equation. Each burned gun pit a line erased from a hostile text. Somewhere near Soprano, the river's character improves. Banks are less cunning, fords more cooperative, bridges wider in their souls. A single Bailey sings under weight with the pure tone that has become a comfort medal telling the truth. Tanks pass in the slow gait that honors timbers and men both. Crews counting bolts like prayer beads. A Sherman slips, is caught by a wrecker that grunts its old, mule-like hymn. A Churchill throws a track, and a sledge persuades pins back into democracy. This more than any charge is the image the campaign deserves: effort that does not tire of being effort, steel that consents to be humble for the sake of distance. On the left, the high shoulders unbuttoned by mountain troops continue to lean outward, tugging the enemy's jacket askew. On the right, the low country pulls a sleeve in the opposite direction. The effect is a widening that even stubbornness cannot deny. Columns split into braided intentions, a thrust to Valmontone to pinch the road that feeds the capital's southern throat, a pressure along Route 6 that refuses to yield the theater's main thread, a quiet, insistent sweep through villages with washed stone churches and courtyards that smell of dust and basil, where doors open just enough for eyes to count boots. You can feel the city's gravity begin to act on morale, and maps alike, compasses twitch. Hearts measure faster. The defenders, who were never foolish, become thrifty. The great clashes shrink to pinpricks that draw blood and leave fingers stinging. A single gun behind a wall waits for the first Sherman to dare the piazza and chooses its moment like a surgeon. A squad of infantry holds a bridge too long, and pays the price without complaint. A commander on the far side reads the same map and understands that loss, at this hour, is a kind of investment. The tanks answer with the mountain's manners walls first. Flanks guarded, speed applied with knowledge rather than hunger. The graveyard myth fades to a superstition you keep for luck. The garden grows lanes multiplied by discipline, exits carved from stubborn corners by people who have learned the arithmetic of survival. Beyond Valmontone, the Appian dreams of its youth and offers straightness to men who no longer believe in straight answers. The advance does not gallop. It glides bounded by reconnaissance, flanked by ghosting infantry, timed by artillery that has learned the patience of a clockmaker. When a farm track looks too generous, a bayonet finds wire. When a ditch looks friendly, a pole finds depth. A crocodile turns a stubborn outbuilding into steam. An Avray plants a brief, brutal period in a bunker sentence. The column moves again. Rome's pale dome and taller pine-black silhouettes begin to rhyme with the horizon rather than contradict it. In the interstices, life insists on being noticed. A woman steps into a yard with a broom and sweeps dust that the war keeps delivering. A boy counts tanks and loses count on purpose because the number is larger than a child ought to memorize. A priest hat lost somewhere behind Cassino blesses a bridge and the hands that laid it. A mechanic wipes his spanner on a rag and realizes it smells like olives from a grove he repaired under. You are pulled from your arrows and labels and made to see that the thing moving is not metal, but consensus, 1,000 small agreements with ground, time, fear, and work. Pontecorvo and Piedimonte shrink on the map like arguments conceded. And the long belt once whispered as the Hitler line becomes a remembered texture rather than a curb on fate. The next belt has new names and the same teeth, but the army has new enamel too, the kind grown by repeated cold mornings and evenings of small triumphs. Tank crews talk less about targets and more about timing. Infantry less about heroism and more about angle. Sappers less about miracles and more about method. The campaign's archetypes hold steel as instrument, ground as teacher, patience as law. Even the crows along the road seem to approve, hopping from wreck to weathered milestone with a bored professionalism. On the city's lip, the advance hesitates not from fear, but from etiquette. A road becomes a boulevard without noticing. Fields turn to gardens, cover to walls with stenciled numbers. Tanks that survived cliffs and culverts yield intersections to men who have practiced house talk and courtyard grammar. Direct fire becomes a scalpel again. Smoke is laid to preserve faces as much as hulls. A squad creeps along a wall where chalk marks show ration prices from last year. A Churchill waits at a corner, not because it cannot go, but because someone inside the net whispers, 2 minutes. And 2 minutes is cheaper than tomorrow's photograph of a burned hull and a broken doorway. You're tempted to shout. Go, the day replies. We are. Then, as such days often conclude, arrival feels less like conquest than like entering a room where conversation has been waiting. The first tanks nose under umbrella pines, tracks ring on old stone, the air smells of smoke and bread, diesel and fountains. Rome does not greet, Rome receives. Route 6 inhales its river of steel and sighs it into streets that have argued with emperors and traffic both. There are flags, yes, and flowers, and faces that have learned to be careful and are surprised to forget caution for an hour. A Sherman parks shyly by a fountain and looks smaller than it has any right to. A Churchill pauses under a balcony light like a beast ushered into a museum. You, who have traced this path from Monkstone to City Cobble, understand that the hinge has swung not because a door was forced, but because hands learned how to turn it. The graves remain for tanks and men both up there on terraces, where poppies will speak the old syllables every spring. In orchards across the Liri, black silhouettes tilt like grammar marks, warning against haste. The garden remains 2 bridges humming under honest weight. Lanes chalked by tape that flutters now like decoration rather than sentence. Fields bearing the impressed memory of tracks that did not presume. The campaign's truth is not a slogan, but a craft steel is most alive when it knows it is muscle, not bone. Terrain is most generous when asked with humility. Speed is only a virtue when escorted by patience and fed by logistics. Courage is what remains when all of that fails and the inch must still be taken. Night falls on Rome with a softness the mountain would not allow. Engines tick into sleep. Guns are cleaned with the same care as teeth. Orders are folded less tightly than last week. Somewhere a crewman leans on a fender and listens to a fountain pretending history is water made new. Somewhere a sapper ties off a roll of tape with a knot he hopes never to untie again. Somewhere a chaplain, at last, has a church with a roof and is surprised to desire the open sky of trenches. The monastery on its torn spine sits dark far behind, not conquered so much as obliged. The valley lies like a scored page. The road ahead stretches into obligations none of these men can yet imagine. You, who asked whether mountainous terrain is a tank graveyard, carry the answer in the weight of these scenes. It can be. When pride believes steel writes its own scripture, it need not be. When hands, feet, and engines agree to read the land first and speak second. The armor that died taught the living. The living learned to make of tanks not monuments but bridges. Between stone and city, between Rapido's malice and Rome's lights, the campaign wrote a long sentence in which the most beautiful words were not charge or crush, but hold, lift, wait, and through.